All right, welcome to part 3. And today we're going to take a look at probably the most important aspect of learning photography, which is equivalent exposures. Now, equivalent exposures is not the most fun thing to learn. However, until you really get this, you're going to struggle in photography. And you can't advance to those next steps, which are composition, lighting, etc. So today I'm going to walk you through equivalent exposures, and it's really going to be up to you to practice this. It takes a bit to get it. And this is going to really make you efficient at getting the correct exposure and adjusting your exposure and understanding what you get from an image. What in the world is an equivalent exposure? So in photography, it refers to the different combinations of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO sensitivity settings that produce the same exposure value, which means the exposure is exactly the same in all three images, but the combination of the numbers is different, resulting in equally bright images. In other words, changing one of these settings while compensating with another can achieve the same exposure. Exposure is something we have to have. We have to have the correct exposure. And if you look at these three images, they're all exposed exactly the same. So the amount of light that's entering the camera and creating that exposure is exactly the same. However, how we get to that is completely different. And so I did this in easy steps to make this understandably. And once again, we're always working in full stop increments. So S is going to stand for shutter speed, A is for aperture, and ISO is 100. And you'll see the constant here. So we have an ISO of 100 in this image, in this image. That aspect doesn't change. And that's pretty normal that you set your ISO kind of within a working range so you can get some varied numbers and you just kind of leave it. The only time you would need to change it is if you kind of rate the maximum or minimum adjustment with shutter speed and aperture. In this first image, we have a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second and an aperture of f4. That aperture of f4 is giving us a really shallow depth of field because the lower this number, the shallower depth of field, meaning the least amount of the background is going to be in focus. And you can see here, in this image, it's the same exposure, and we'll go through this on another sheet in just a second, but this is a 60th of a second at f8 at ISO 100. Same exposure, however, the settings are different. So we have a slower shutter speed and higher aperture. That mid aperture is bringing some of that background in focus. Now, once again, we call this depth of field, and depth of field isn't just aperture. It's also distance to subject and focal length. But for right now, we're just going to assume it's aperture. And then if we come down here, now I'm using a tripod because if we remember in the last tutorial, you really don't want to go below a 60th of a second or you might get a little motion blur. And it was windy out that day. And if you look at the flowers in some of these, you might actually see a little bit of motion blur. But this one we have f16, same exposure. However, look how much of the background is in focus. So what are we doing? Well, we're controlling basically a couple of things, movement and depth of field. So in this image, we have a faster shutter speed, which is able to stop action. You can see right here, there's a little streak. That's actually a raindrop. And so it didn't stop it in action. It blurred it, but we can see it in these because the shutter speed was longer. It's just kind of blending into the image and we don't see that blur. In this one, we have a little bit wider depth of field and we have more depth of field in this image. So let's take a look at the ever so unpopular numbers. All right. And yes, I know this can be a little confusing. I did my best to color code this and change everything. Right? So our first set of numbers that we have right here, 1/25th of a second, right here, using the circle in gray. Aperture of 5.6 and ISO of 400, right here. This combination of numbers is exactly the same as this combination of numbers as far as being an equivalent exposure. So 125.56 at 400 is exactly the same as 500 f4 800 and exactly the same as 15th of a second 16 400. How in the world did I do that? So let's go on to the next slide and I'll show you how I'm coming to those conclusions. So let's just simplify this. So if we remember, our first one was 125, 5.6, 400. And if I move my exposure from 125 down to a 15th of a second, first of all, you need to use a tripod or you're going to blur the image. All right. It's okay if you want to blur the image and handhold it, but just know that that's going to happen. And each number that we go down, we are increasing the amount of light. So 125th faster than a 15th of a second. So we're going from click to click, click here. All right. So it's staying open longer. And each number that we go down is a whole stop. So that is plus 1 stop of light, plus 2 stops of light, plus 3 stops of light. So we are now 3 stops overexposed by making this movement. So the equivalent exposure, because 400 isn't going to move, we're going to keep it on that ISO, is taking 5.6 to let less light in. And we know this makes our f-stop smaller in size, larger in number. So if we go this, it's -1, -2, -3. So +1, +2, +3, and then -1, -2, -3 equals 0. So that's our equivalent exposure. These two exposures are exactly the same. However, the result is going to be different because of the combination of numbers. All right, so our next one is going to be more complicated. And this really kind of shows you there's an infinite number of variables when it comes to making equivalent exposures. What we're doing here is we're going to skip shutter speed from now. But right here we're at 5.6, and for some reason we want to go from 5.6 to f16. We're going to get a much wider depth of field. So we're going -1 stop of light, -2 stops of light, -3 stops of light. So it's going to be 3 stops too dark. However, I'm only going to go from 125 to 60 because if I go here, I can't handhold my image and it might become blurry. So let's assume this is a landscape. So we're only gaining 1 stop of light. So we're still -2 stops of light. So then I need to go to my ISO and gain 2 more stops of light. So 1, 2 to 1600. So 125, 5.6, 400 is exactly the same as 60, f16, 1600. Now, if you're completely confused at this point, don't be shocked, because guess what? Most of my students in college are completely confused. It takes them about 3 or 4 weeks to completely understand this and understand how to do an equivalent exposure and as to which direction they need to move the numbers to get the correct one. So a lot of times you'll move it the completely opposite way and it will become even brighter. You need to practice this. And how can we practice this? Well, we can go outside and take a picture of something, all right? Then we can adjust something as far as shutter speed or aperture and then try to compensate for that adjustment. If you're outside and you have 125, 5.6, 400, you can make then a different adjustment and just move your aperture up 3 stops and see if you can compensate for that right off the bat and get another exposure that's exactly the same. The goal here is not to take great photos. The goal here is to learn how to adjust your camera. Until you can learn to adjust your camera, it becomes difficult to focus on other aspects of photography. So let's go ahead and move on. So let's take a look at this. So in this image, how are we using equivalent exposures? Well, we have a portrait of a person, but we want our background to be really, really blurry. Well, to get the really, really blurry, we need to shoot a small f-stop number like 2.8, as low as your camera will go. All right. The lower this number, the more depth of field we're going to get, right? So how do we do this? So usually I set my ISO first, and then I set my aperture. My aperture is next because that's important. What I want is 2.8, and then I'll adjust my shutter speed to get the correct exposure. Because whether my camera's shutter speed is at 1/25th of a second or 4,000th of a second, in this photo, it's really not going to make that much of a difference. What we want is the aperture of f2.8. So we're going to set that second, and then we're going to get the exposure with shutter speed. The only thing you have to do is make sure your shutter speed isn't too slow, and it might blur in a portrait like this. But anything higher than 60th of a second is going to be perfectly fine. Next, a wide depth of field. So this image, we're using an f-stop number that's high on the camera. So on lenses, you're going to see a variety of max or the high end of f-stop numbers. Almost everything's going to have f16. Some lenses are going to have f22, and some will actually have 32. So in this case, we're going to use f16 because we want everything to be in focus. So the higher this number, greater the depth of field. So in this one, I'm going to set that ISO first. Then I'm going to set my aperture at this high number. And then once again, I'm going to set my shutter speed. Now, on an image like this, I could actually use a tripod and shoot with a lower than a 60th of a second of a shutter speed because nothing's moving unless it's windy and the leaves are blowing. Go on to our next image. So in this image, we have an extreme shallow depth of field. So if you look at this image, it's really in focus here, and boy, does it fall off quickly. And this is something that's very popular in photography, is shallow depth of field. I actually prefer shallow depth of field, so almost everything that I shoot is a shallow depth of field. So in this one, we're using that low f-stop number, 2.8 or lower, to get that shallow depth of field. Just like before, we're going to set that ISO, set the aperture, and then set the shutter speed to get the exposure. Our last one here, where we want everything in focus, is just like before. We want a high f-stop number. We're going to set the ISO or ISO, then our aperture, and then our shutter speed to get the correct exposure. Except for don't spell correct like that. Equivalent exposures in photography refer to different combinations of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO or ISO sensitivity settings that produce the same exposure value, resulting in equally bright images, meaning all the exposures look exactly the same. In other words, changing one of these settings while compensating with another can achieve the same overall exposure but yield different results in the depth of field, motion, and image quality. And it is up for you to practice it. The more you practice it, the better you're going to get, the quicker you're going to get, and you can move on to more exciting aspects of taking photographs. Even if you shoot in those scene or semi-automatic modes, understanding these concepts is the key to photography. All right, our next step is autofocus methods for Canon. And if you don't have a Canon camera, just jump forward to either Nikon or Sony. If you don't have Nikon or Sony, if you don't have one of these three cameras, that's okay, because basically they're all going to be very similar. The icons might change a little bit, but you should be able to get the concept or idea of this by looking at any of these. Now, I hope everybody can give me a thumbs up on this video because it took forever to make all these little icons here to show everybody what this means. So we learned before a little bit about autofocus. So we learned that we can switch from the shutter button to the rear back button as an independent button, and that's helpful. We learned there's different methods in which the camera autofocuses. So single, in which it just focuses and then stops. Then there's a continuous mode. Well, it will continually track. You're still going to be using single and continuous on your camera. We're just going to be adding to it. So these autofocus methods are just configuring in the viewfinder where it's going to autofocus. And there's different aspects for different reasons depending on what you're photographing, okay? For Canon, we've got spot, 1 point expanded area around, flexible zone 1, flexible zone 2, flexible zone 3, and the whole area. And just to note before we get going, Canon also has subject tracking, where it can automatically identify a subject, eye tracking, and animal eye tracking. All right, it can also do animal tracking as well. So subject tracking, whether it's a person or an animal, eye tracking for both animals and people, okay? So that is a different area, and that's different than this, but sometimes you need to set up maybe the whole area, and once the whole area is set up, then you apply eye tracking for a human or an animal, depending on what you want to do. Read your manual, but I'm going to explain these and why you would use them. So our first one is spot. This is what I use most of the time because guess what? My camera's older and I don't even have eye tracking. spot is a single point. And what this allows you to get is critical focus. So if I wanted focus on an eye or someone's eye, I can put this little dot right on their eye and focus. And inside your camera, it's not stagnant in the center. You can move this around. So I actually have a video on autofocus. It's called Focus Like a Pro. If you want to watch that, you can see how I'm moving it around and what I'm talking about. Add that in the description. So if you want to go on and check out that Focus Like a Pro, in addition to this, I think it will be helpful. This is for when items are really critical, but if a little dog was running around in a frame, you have trouble keeping this little dot on them. 1 point is a little bit bigger than point, all right? And this might be good for like a non-moving subject, but you still want it to be kind of critical. But it might not help you on that dog running around. Then we have expanded, and this is for a larger area. So it's basically this. And look, it's still a very small area in your viewfinder. Then you have expanded, and so this is slightly larger than this. These two are good for subjects where it's not important to focus exactly on their eye, but just get them in focus. And then we have these flexible zones, which don't really mean anything. And this is a larger zone, and it's a square zone in the camera. So it's larger than this, and it's square. Then you have a large vertical, and then you have a large horizontal, and then you have the whole area. Let's say you're doing bird photography, or you're trying to catch an animal like a fox running. So these larger areas are going to make it easier for your camera to stay in focus on that subject because you don't have to keep this little dot. What I think you'll find out is you probably only use 1 or 2 of these, and most likely never use the rest. So in my case, I would probably use this and the whole area, or this right here, in conjunction with eye tracking, animal eye tracking, and subject tracking. These are really nice. And if you're using subject tracking and you have 2 people equidistant standing right next to each other, and it's focusing on the person on the left, usually you can just tap the button on the back of your camera to the right, and it will switch the focus. So you can do it, and it will accidentally sometimes pick up the wrong person. So you could just tap something and tell it to go to the next. So those are the Canon autofocus methods. Try them out, see what you like, and practice with all of them and get used to learning how to adjust, especially if you're in an older DSLR. You need to know how to adjust this. All right, autofocus methods for Nikon. And look at this mistake here. And this is actually not a mistake. I just didn't have the L, and I could have probably cloned that out and put an L, but I can just tell you what it means. It's just as easy. So once again, this is from the smallest focus point to the largest as we go down. So we're going to call this pinpoint with Nikon, and this is going to let you have critical focus, and you can move this around, and this around. So that means those focus points can move around your viewfinder. We have single point, which is a little larger than this, good for critical focus. Dynamic area, which is good for moving action. We have wide area, and this is weird. So we have wide area small, which is a smaller, and then we have a wider version, and it's be wide area L. And so it would be wide L here, but I didn't have the wide L, and I forgot to clone this in as an L. I'll probably do that later, but for right now, it's an S. Then we have wide area people. So this is a wide area and you're trying to get people. And if you have 2 people in this, just like before, you can usually tap or toggle between the 2. We have wide area animals. Then we have auto area, which is basically the whole viewfinder. Then we have auto area people and auto area animals. And just like that, both of these allow for face and eye detection. You have to go into another menu because they make it really easy, and you have to designate, do you want subject, or in this case it's face, not subject. Do you want face or eye detection, or do you want animal face or animal eye detection? A lot to choose from. These are pretty helpful. I have to say face and eye detection is pretty awesome. Last of all, we got Sony, and Sony has lots of stuff, even though you don't see this. We have spot, and we have S, M, and L because there's a small spot, a medium spot, and a large spot. I know it's difficult, but just like before, this can move around, and this is great for critical focus. We have an expanded spot. We have a center fix, which is larger than expanded spot, so this is good for subjects. We have zones, meaning you can be in this zone, the center zone, or the right zone. We have wide, which uses the whole area of the frame. And there's also, just like everything else, options for subject and eye tracking available. Now look, Sony has that it recognizes planes and cars and all kinds of other crazy things. Basically, I use subject and eye, but they do have other options. But they just have some basic modes, which I think is great. You don't need that many. And then you have the expanded ability to do subject tracking and eye tracking as well. Our next thing here is lens image stabilization. And look, cameras have both lens image stabilization and some cameras have IBIS, which is an internal stabilization on the sensor. Right now, we're talking about stabilization that's done inside of the lens. Now, not all lenses have that. And you'll know because your lens will probably say VR if it's Nikon, IS if it's Canon, or OSS if it's Sony. All right, this means you have lens stabilization. And this stabilization is used to reduce motion blur while shooting at slower speeds. Lens stabilization is used to reduce motion blur while shooting at slow shutter speeds. If you're shooting with a longer lens, right? Let's say we're shooting with a 200. Well, 60th of a second handheld will work for a portrait, but you know what? It might blur a lot. So if you remember, I said you can also have a minimum shutter speed that's equal to your shutter speed, which is equal to your focal length. So with a 200 millimeter lens, really the slowest you should shoot is 1/200th of a second so you don't get any motion blur. But still, that's kind of right on the edge. And if you don't have enough light, and let's say you need to shoot at a 60th or 1/25th of a second, if you turn on vibration reduction, what happens is, even though you're holding a camera as steady as possible, it's still moving a little bit. And when you press the shutter, it's going to jiggle. It helps to compensate for that movement. If you shoot at a 60th of a second and you have vibration reduction, it's not going to freeze action. It's just going to help reduce that motion blur. And depending on the cameras, they usually have one or two settings, and it can help with a couple of stops, and it works really well. Now, we also have something called IBIS. IBIS is in-body image stabilization. And from my knowledge, I think only mirrorless cameras have this at this point, and not all cameras have it. And most likely, if you have a basic camera, it is not going to have this. But what this does is a gyroscope on the sensor. And really, this was designed for shooting video. It does come into effect using still photos. So you can use the combination of lens stabilization and camera stabilization to really kind of beat out all that motion blur. And if you're shooting video and you're doing it handheld, it will give you a much smoother video than it would if you were hand holding it without a Steadicam or gyroscope or anything like that, like a gimbal. So that is in-body image stabilization. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up. That would be great. If you have any comments or questions, you can always leave those below, and don't forget to subscribe.